What is something about yourself that sounds totally made up but is 100% real? Oh boy, this is gonna be weird. I died first, and then was born. I have told this story a few times on Reddit, but I enjoy telling it over and over, so here we go again. During the cesarean to bring me into the world, there was some major complication on my mother's end. She started bleeding internally, drowning me in the womb. When I was removed, the doctors tried to get me breathing but couldn't. I was declared dead. My mother was still unconscious, but my dad was brought in to say goodbye to me. He held me in his arms. When he was saying goodbye, out of nowhere I started coughing up blood and screamed as babies do. Apparently, it was the weirdest moment in his life. Of course it was. It's understandable. Being overly terrified at one moment and then getting super overwhelmed with joy over the fact that I was alive. After all, it's my favorite story to tell, because weirdly it takes some pressures off on birthdays. I don't do well with too much attention by family friends, but celebrating my death day doesn't normally bring people the same connotations. My great-grandma ran a brothel back at the turn of the 20th century. She was Algonquin and people were pretty racist back then, so she had a hard time getting business. Since it was a coastal town, Maine, she bought up a couple leaky old rowboats and would load them up with hookers and booze and row them out to the ships at night. When ships came into port, most of the crew would get offshore leave and would hit the bars and brothels in town. But they always had to leave a few sailors on the ship just to keep an eye on it. My great-grandmother figured those guys had money too and probably felt left out. With that thought in mind, she basically set up water-based slot lizards, or uberhose one might say, and kept earnings. My grandpa and his sisters basically grew up in the brothel and no one would talk to them or socialize with them. My grandpa met my grandma picking green beans for a local farmer. Over the period of time they fell in love. When they wanted to get married, they had to leave the state to get away from her family that were utterly disgusted by the fact that she would marry the son of a whore. Then, as any deeply in love couple would do, they ran off to Detroit. They chose the state because back then GM was hiring and they wanted a normal job there. So, that's how my family came to Michigan. I took my mother for a surprise trip to NYC. She got married to my father there in 1968. A young happy newlyweds fell not only in love with each other but the city as well. The surprise was manufactured by way of telling her we were going to Australia. So it is super close and not a huge deal since we live in New Zealand. It's the type of thing you could do for the weekend, and therefore she packed a LIFGHT bag and brought her passport. After we got to the airport it popped. Surprise! We are going to New York. And she cried her eyes out with delight. I couldn't describe her joy during the flight. It was childishly amazing. When we arrived, on our first morning, I said, "Okay, what do you want to do?" She said, "When I was here the last time, in 1968, the Twin Towers weren't complete, so I'd like to go to the top of them." "Your wish is my command," I said, and off we went to the WTC. That was the afternoon of September 10, 2001. We ended the day with a meal very near the building as well. Suffice it to say, the next morning, there was a particular poignancy when we looked out the window at around 8 a.m. and our trip ended up becoming the one we can't forget for the rest of our lives. My dad kidnapped me and took me to Singapore for very malicious purposes, I'm sure you could imagine. I was 15 and my dad literally had fake documents and suitcases filled with random clothes. When we got there we went to a sketchy hotel and after 15 minutes he went to the bar. A bit after that, some guy just walked in. I was confused but he began muttering saying I was too pale and too old and he left. I called my dad but he didn't answer, so I climbed out through the window and went to the police. They put me on a plane home that same hour. I don't really tell people this because it's a bit of a crazy story and sounds made up. After all, that's why it's here now. In Minnesota in the 70s, I was 16 taking my driver's test. Nervous as hell. A highway patrol officer was the road tester back then, which was even more nerve-wracking. But I thought I was doing pretty good the whole time because I had lots of practice with my parents. Then towards the end of the driving test, I was at a T intersection across from my hospital. I was hesitant to turn onto the road because traffic was busy. I could tell the officer was getting a little impatient, but he was nicely telling me to be a little aggressive. Suddenly at the hospital across from us, someone pushed out a screen from a window on the third floor psych ward. A woman jumped out the window onto a garage roof underneath, then jumped to the ground and ran across the road right by us. The officer had me turn around. I was in my mom's car and chased the girl in the neighborhood. When I would pull up to a stop sign during the chase, he would say, "Joe, go, just go through it." After a while, when she started to get away, he gave up with me being the chase driver and told me to head back to the DMV office. I was a complete shaking mess at this point, ready to accept the fact I would not get a license anytime soon. Devastating for a 16-year-old boy. He grabbed my score sheet, said "You passed," and handed it to me. I got an 88 score. He ran to his HW patrol car and tore off to continue the chase. I go in the office a complete mess. My mom was already really nervous because we were gone so long. Then she saw me looking like a ghost. She said, "What happened?" Told her I passed, then told her the story on the way home. She wasn't amused and pretty pissed at the highway patrol guy. When I tell the story, I say no BS, just ask my mom. I lost my job in housing in early 2017. I'd been homeless before and slept rough on the streets, although that was in California where the weather was at least bearable. This time I was living in North Dakota, and I'd seen what the winters were like. I figured if I was going to have to sleep on the streets again, I'd better move somewhere where I didn't have to contend with hypothermia for a good part of the year, so used the last of my money to relocate to Arizona. I had a totally impractical plan of finding work and then housing within a few weeks before my remaining funds ran out, but the deadline came and went and I found myself on the streets again. A homeless advocate I'd reached out to tried to get me sheltered at a place for homeless veterans, but being a civilian, they turned me away. Aforementioned advocate reached an accommodation with the veterans by setting up an overnight shelter for homeless civilians next door that I would run for him. In exchange, I would be allowed to sleep on their property outside the walls, use their facilities like showers and bathrooms, and join in their communal meals if they had enough food. Because the civilian shelter was an overnight thing, I really didn't have much to do, or anywhere to go, in the day, so I spent more and more time with the vets. I took it on myself to help them with odd jobs like security, packing lunches for the local homeless who couldn't live with them to come and get, unloading donations from concerned citizens, and security fire watch while the camp slept at night. I soon became the camp's unofficial official cook, which was awesome, because I love cooking and it was a challenge cooking meals for so many people so quickly, using an outdoor kitchen with bare-bones facilities. I gradually began to take on more responsibilities with the vets, and the overnight shelter was more like a side gig. The vets repeatedly asked me to move into the walls and stay with them, making me full-time, but I refused at first because I felt like it would be letting down the guy who I was running the overnight shelter for. I woke up one day to see the vets dismantling the tent we used for the overnight shelter, and one of them wryly asked me, "Where are you going to stay now?" I moved in with the guys later that day. A couple of months later, the incumbent base commander and his family had secured housing for themselves, and he didn't ask as much as tell me I would be taking over for them. They had thought about who was going to take on the job after they left and decided I was apparently the only one fit for the role, due to my diligence and enthusiasm for helping my newfound friends. And there were parts of it that were tough, and really grated. I felt like I had to constantly prove myself to the big dick swinging mentality veterans, who felt that, as a veterans camp, it should have been run by a vet. I was also just as homeless as my men. We had nothing but tent fabric to protect us from the elements, sometimes little food or water, and constant issues with the local tweakers and criminal elements of the homeless. But helping these people get off the streets and or reunited with their families is hands down one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done in life. If you like our content, don't forget to subscribe and leave what you think in the comments section below. See you soon.